Greetings, everyone. I am Syed Jaffery, and I welcome you to the CSSPR webinar series in which we analyze security, strategic, and foreign policy issues. In her latest book titled The Insider's Game: How Elites Make War and Peace, Elizabeth Saunders argues that elites are a different audience from the public as they have the capacity to impose those costs and constraints on leaders that the public cannot. While Saunders' work is solely focused on US decision making apropos of war and peace, its broader findings speak to how elites affect matters of war and peace around the world. Understanding these effects are particularly important in making sense of rivalries. The decades long nuclear tinged rivalry between India and Pakistan is no exception, especially because it has been not only marked by wars but also efforts, albeit piecemeal, toward improving relations. At a time when South Asia's regional integration is stifled by the perennial Indo-Pak acrimony, it is extremely important to assess how far leaders can help change things around. And with Narendra Modi securing a third term for himself only with the support of his allies, it is critical to analyze the extent to which domestic politics will affect his policies towards Pakistan. To discuss this, we are fortunate to be joined by ACE South Asia watcher, Dr. Christopher Clary. Dr. Clary is an associate professor of political science at the University of Albany and a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center, South Asia program. His book, The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia, was published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at the Brown University, a predoctoral fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University, a Stanton Nuclear Security predoctoral fellow at the RAND Corporation, um, and a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in India. Clary also served as Country Director for South Asian Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense from 2006 until 2009, as a Senior Research Associate at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California from 2003 until 2005, and a Resident Assistant at the Henry L. Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. from 2001 until 2003. Thank you very much for taking out the time to join us, Dr. Clary. It is always a pleasure to talk to you. You recently, a couple of years ago, rather, wrote this book, The Difficult Politics of Peace, Rivalry in Modern South Asia. I believe there is no better time to talk about the basic tenets and arguments of your book than today. Recently, elections were held in India, which resulted in Narendra Modi coming into power not the way he expected, but with the help of his allies. Given the fact that now he has to contend with political rivals or co-equals, I would rather say, despite the fact that they don't have the numbers of seats that make them at par, but still they have a lot of space to maneuver politically. It would be interesting to see how relations between India and Pakistan pan out, and also how Narendra Modi navigates this problem and looks at broader and deals with other broader foreign policy issues. So what I would like for you to do now is to, for the benefit of our audience, just give a brief rundown of your argument, in particular the leadership primacy theory, and then we can take the discussion forward.
Sure. I started working on South Asian politics as as an intern back in 2000 during the Musharraf era and the Vajpayee era in India. And I started at the Stimson Center, which is a think tank in DC that still is quite interested in finding ways to build confidence and encourage normalization between India and Pakistan because of a concern that many of us have that the competition between India and Pakistan um, is one of several sources of nuclear danger in the international system. And that rating of that danger varies over time, and Ukraine now is higher, other things may be higher, but it's this persistent concern. So I've been working on trying to consider ways to stabilize crises, improve the bilateral relationship, build confidence for 2 decades plus now. And the book was a product of me when I had the chance to return to academia, reflecting on years of kind of failure in that regard. When I started writing the dissertation in earnest, the Kashmir ceasefire, which had been kind of a bright spot after the failure of the Musharraf, Manmohan Singh, Musharraf, Vajpayee normalization. After that kind of collapsed by the latter part of the 2000s. You know, how did that come to be? And the book also emerged from my experiences in 3 years in the Pentagon, where the political difficulty of doing big things was impressed upon me again and again as a bureaucrat. So part of the argument for the book is in the title, which is the politics of peacemaking are difficult. There are lots of people that will oppose it. And so you need leaders who have unique authority within their systems in order to take on those difficult politics. And so the strategic incentives, the economic cost, the geopolitical cost of conflict, I argue in the book, are inadequate. That provides a motive, but the capability to act on that motive, I propose, has to be these leaders that have what I call primacy within their system. And so the theory that I lay out in the book is I label leader primacy theory, to say that both the leaders have to have that authority, that concentrated control over foreign policy in order to turn strategic incentives into changed policy, and also that role of elites has primacy over those incentives. Incentives are inadequate to explain when rivalries get better or worse. They are part of the puzzle, but the other part is this configuration of political power within states.
Thank you. This is a very succinct rundown of your book. Uh, I just have a quick follow up based on that. When we talk about deterrence, we talk about the eye of the beholder problem. It's, I think, strategic incentives are affected by the same problem. Incentives. So, if the leader is, if the leader thinks that this period is propitious or incentivizing, he probably could act. So before the primacy theory comes into play, I believe, and I would love to have your thoughts on that, the leader has to see that particular moment as an opportune one. If he's unwilling to see that particular moment as a kind of a window to improve relations, then I believe he won't be able to do the he won't be able to start that legwork, which then would make him come into contact with his co-equals or with the veto players.
Sure. One of my professors at MIT, Stephen Van Ivra, who's since retired, uh, he used to argue often in class that you have to think about theories that can operate um, based on a material basis alone, how the world really is. But then you should see if that theory is not operating on that material basis, do you need to repair it by allowing for perception to take center stage? Um, and I do think that we're all creatures trying to navigate a confusing, ambiguous world, and those perceptions matter a lot. And so I spend a fair amount of the book trying to look at how leaders, senior officials saw things. We don't always have that evidence, especially I think on the Pakistani side. We don't have great archival evidence, right? So we have to rely on memoirs, we have to rely on contemporary diplomatic accounts. Um, Ironically, we have to rely often on what Pakistani leaders told Indian diplomats, because India has released a lot more of its diplomatic cables. I mean, Pakistan, to a first approximation, has released no diplomatic cables, barring what The Intercept may have published in the last 2 years. So we have some gaps, and I try to triangulate as best I can. But I agree with you. These perceptions matter. Um, but one thing that I think is clear is leaders are often as concerned with their domestic configuration of power as they are with the international configuration of power. So they are making a calculation that can have perceptual shortfalls, but that they spend a lot of energy trying to figure out where they sit compared to competing elites within their system.
Yes, I think this makes a lot of sense, and you talked about the problems with the finding sources, primary sources in Pakistan. I completely agree with you. That is one of the most pressing problems that any academic working on South Asia or especially Pakistan would face. And I think this is something that needs to be sorted, so that I believe the picture of and about Pakistan would remain incomplete no matter how good or rigorous your research is. It will remain incomplete because you just don't have the access to archival sources. um, you'll often have to tell Pakistan's story through that through the vantage points of those who have told you about Pakistan, not what Pakistan actually probably did or what Pakistan's position on that particular issue was. So this is a big academic glitch that we need to solve and solve quickly. Okay.
Sure. I think, so the big challenge is obviously there's very few policymakers that saw the 80s that are still alive, right? There are policymakers in Pakistan, fewer now than when I started the project from the 90s onward. And so I did try, I spoke with uh, several different ambassadorial rank foreign service officers, military, 3 stars that were present, and corps commanders meetings where things came up. So I did try my best and I did similar things on the Indian and to a lesser extent with the U.S. officials. Did my best to try to find ways to plug the gaps we have. But I would encourage, I actually think for researchers that are based in Pakistan that are listening to this conversation, I think an opportunity exists both for people to start donating their papers. That's happening on the Indian side. Ashoka University in Delhi now hosts the papers of many Indian diplomats. I think that's a great initiative, and certified scholars can get access to them. Or if that's too hard because of concerns about classification, a thing that India has done for a long time is have a trusted think tank be in charge of collecting oral histories. And then officials can edit those before they're released to the public, but at least there's a tape and a transcript, and so it's not lost. And ideally, like India has, like the U.S. and the UK do, I would hope Pakistan starts releasing its archives, because I think Pakistan has a story to tell, and it's not always best for that story to only come out in memoirs and journalistic accounts.
Speaking of which, I Dr. Akhtar's book, The Blind Eye, that account is based off of U.S. archives. So imagine a Pakistani scholar telling a story in a brilliant way, but by using US archives, not Pakistani archives, because those Pakistani archives were not available for her to look at or dabble in. So yes, this is a problem that obviously needs to be fixed as soon as possible, because yes, we have a story to tell, and a very good one, and a very compelling one at that. Um, so I there is this, even in IR literature, there was, up until like I guess 2001 or 2, there was little focus on the implications or the effects of domestic politics. That is changing with books like this, and even other books too. So domestic politics now is becoming a very important component of trying to understand foreign policy behaviors. And your book is all about domestic politics, basically how domestic politics um, prevail over the strategic milieu that is being created in and around these rival states. But before that, you spend a good amount of time in the book explaining why you focused on understanding a particular rivalry. So because this would dovetail nicely with our conversation, with our subsequent conversation. I would like for you to quickly explain why understanding rivalries matter.
Yeah. So political scientists um, come in different varieties. And some of those political scientists say that at the end of the day, only the power of states really matters. And that power then generates fear or apathy, depending on the capabilities of the state in question. I have some sympathy for that sort of more purely what we might call a neo-realist, because it's so concerned with power and how power shapes international political outcomes. I have some sympathy for that approach. But I'm layering on another variable, which are these perceptions that states have about threat. And that also fits within this broader family of realism, though it also fits in other schools as well. And there is a research tradition that says that conflicts don't emerge between and among states randomly. They don't even once you take into account the strictures of geography, they don't. But rather, states get into these perceptual habits of rivalry where they get into crises and conflicts and wars over and over again. And these enduring strategic rivalries are a source of a majority of the war and hardship that emerges in the international system. And so, if we want to understand war, or if we want to understand its absence, peace, then we have to figure out how these rivalries emerge. And once they emerge, they're not all enduring. You know, the the Sino-Soviet split happened in the 60s, but China and Russia today are fine, maybe even allies. Uh, so when do these rivalries dissipate sufficiently that politics become normal again? And so the book is trying to figure that out, and it wants to trace the gamut that political relations among rivals can take. And so that can be reconciliation, that can even eventually lead to rivalry termination. Or things can get worse. There can be crises, conflicts, and war. So I want to look at both directions of escalatory behavior, but also rapprochement, diplomatic improvement in behavior as well.
Thank you. This is an important point for the understanding of our audience. I think it's critical to also look at how um, a compendium of factors, including incentives, domestic politics, how, and the strength of the leader as well. You do mention that the type of leader is not necessarily important than his authority over foreign policy matters are. I think the type of leader is somewhat important because that determines the capacity or the ability of a particular leader to take the plunge and navigate those problems or impediments that they might face. Um, Now coming to India and the recent results of the election, um, Modi did not win the 400 that he was looking at. Up ki bar 400 did not happen. He could only manage 240 seats. But he has announced a cabinet which has the four lead ministries are the same. So he has uh, employed or deployed or whatever you want to call it his his key people at the topmost ministries. So that means when we talk about foreign policy, he has Jai Shankar backed on the seat, which means that he will be able. They will continue having that working relationship. Uh, if you look at Rajnath Singh, he is also there. So Rajnath Singh has had a great say in matters pertaining to Pakistan, and he has been vocal about a lot of things which directly relate to or affect Pakistan, be it the his August 16, 2019 remark on the NFU policy, or his remarks on taking over Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, obviously through the use of force from Pakistan. So, what do these cabinet, the composition of the cabinet portend for Indo-Pak relations and Modi's
Sure.
ability to, further consolidate his authority, despite the fact that he's in a bit weak position as compared to 2019.
Yeah, it's I've discussed so far in our interview my sadness of the lack of our archival information about Pakistan. Um, I think with the India case, we actually have a lack of detailed journalism on how the Modi cabinet works. Um, it's not at all clear to me that Jaishankar is particularly important in foreign policy decision making. Jaishankar is crucially important in being an external voice for India and establishing a brand for India and himself in the process. That is clear. But think in your own mind, you follow the news closely. Our audience can think of examples themselves. In the last 10 years, what are things that Jaishankar and Shah and Singh disagreed about? Who won? We don't know very much about any of those things. There's very little that the Modi prime ministry, maybe to its credit, is not very leaky about these things. I think I can say with some certainty that the National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, is very important. The press reporting on that seems unequivocal in my mind. Um, but the relative balance of influence of Modi versus Singh versus Shah versus Jaishankar, that's not at all clear to me from the reporting. Um, and so one thing that's challenging for a theory like this is we will have inadequate evidence about Modi's configuration of power today. That's very different than the situation we have when I look back at the Ayub Khan period and can read a lot of letters and things that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was saying to contemporaries, that Ayub Khan was writing. We have really detailed information on that period. On the Indian side, the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru uh, are honestly a global treasure. We have tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of pages of Nehru's letters. And I have a very good sense from that of his relationship with all of his cabinet ministers, who he was angry with, who he was fighting with, who he disagreed with. So it's hard sometimes in a book like this, where I wanted to trace the India-Pakistan relationship from 47 to more or less the year that it was coming out, 2022, that I had so much less data about the more recent period. In some eras, um, I could make it up. I could talk to officials that had then retired, and that helped a lot in the Musharraf years, for example. Um, but the Modi era, I think, is still a little bit of a mystery. But my strong inclination is that he still has a lot of primacy in that cabinet. That his relative power compared to the next most important member of his cabinet is considerable. And my hunch is it's probably Shah, but I'm not confident in that. That is the next most important member of his cabinet, and that is, if I were to look for a veto point, it would probably be there. But I'm not certain, and I think that will be interesting as these individuals retire if they have enough time to give interviews and write memoirs. It's not clear to me that will be the case. Modi is quite old. Doval is very old. And so these people may not have a long post-career retirement. But we may have to wait until further information is available in 10 or 15 years. Uh, you started, though, this portion of by asking about whether the type of leader matters a lot. And I think there is something to that. I am a little, I think Modi has indicated an ideological skepticism of normalization that might mute strategic incentives, might change his perceptions of what those incentives look like. But Modi, I think, is a good example of why we can't easily label somebody as a certain type one way or the other, because he started his time in office, with the inauguration, Tamasha, and then going to Raiwind. And that was a choice to sort of say, I'm going to try to brand myself as a peacemaker. That fell apart. I think it fell apart for reasons that were not of Modi's own making, as Nawaz Sharif has indicated to the PMLN party workers in the last few months. So, but since it fell apart, since Pathankot, since 2016, he hasn't been willing to seriously reconsider that choice, it seems to me. And then earlier, something I talked about in the book is, Pervez Musharraf, the architect of Kargil, I do think starts a very meaningful normalization initiative with Vajpayee and then with Manmohan Singh, and that does endure.
I think yes, you you've sketched it out well. From your book, I think there are two things. Modi is Modi is very powerful, but he's not as powerful or obviously he's not intellectually solid as Nehru was. So the way Nehru could prevail upon, let's say, Patel was attribute could be attributed to his heft and his role in the Indian freedom movement, and and also he was a man of letters. One of the reasons as to why you may not be able to find a lot of accounts on modern day Indian political bickering or lack thereof is that Modi is not um, into writing or into communicating things like this at all. Um, but there's another thing to it. In your book, you mention about the period when Indira Gandhi was a cabinet minister, but she was trying to, bypass a very feeble, both physically and competence wise, rather, I would, if I were to say, Shastri. And 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 she was able to prevail upon him in many decision making streams. I don't think right now anybody in the Modi cabinet, this is my opinion, has the capacity or the heft to bypass Modi and take decisions on their own, because Modi has over the past so many years, and Jaffer Lord does a good job of covering Modi's rise to power in his book Modi's India. Um, he has done he has taken a lot of steps to consolidate his power to the point where it can't be challenged from within as some of as that of other previous prime ministers was at various stages. Um, but again,
I think,
we don't know.
yeah, it's challenging. I think the situation you're saying where there's a more nominally junior member who actually might be more powerful than the national leader, that's somewhat rare in my view. Indira with Shastri seems like a clear case from the contemporary evidence.
And Bhutto
Uh,
and Ayub, yeah, for a
Bhutto and
good
Ayub
period of time.
toward Ayub's later years. Not the last later years. Bhutto was out, but um, so those are odd cases. More common is a leader just feeling as if the ground underneath their feet is not firm and deciding not to take big steps. And that is quite common. Leaders they can sense their colleagues have unease. And they say, if my colleagues are uneasy, I'm not going to proceed. That's something that seems to be what happened with Vajpayee at Agra. We still don't fully know what occurred there. Um, and that hesitance um, it leads to what I call like self-censorship. That leaders may have an inclination to pursue a peace initiative, but they're worried their colleagues won't support them, and then they're worried their colleagues' lack of support indicate maybe a potential public backlash. So I think leaders often want to have everything battened down so they can avoid that public backlash if they proceed and make a meaningful compromise with an adversary.
This is also quite clearly demonstrated in your chapter on Bhutto. Like in the first half of his term, up until August 1973, he was unsure about his hold on power, and this is why he was a bit circumspect in reaching out to India substantively with an olive branch. So yeah, this you in your chapter on Bhutto and Gandhi, you do make a draw a distinction between the two periods in Bhutto's tenure. Like when he was President Bhutto, he was circumspect and a bit he acted gingerly, but then Prime Minister Bhutto was different. So yeah, this
Yeah, I mean, the Pakistani diplomats we know from India's records are quite clear that Bhutto tells them he's not going to make any serious steps towards normalization um, until he has the constitution that he has authored uh, through, and you're right, changes his title within the system, makes it much harder for the parliament to bring down the prime minister, and then ushers in a series of civil military changes. And then, throughout his time in office, Bhutto goes and selectively fires most of the senior military leadership, and then finally attempts to do one additional piece of coup proofing by creating a joint
FSL.
chairman
Yeah.
and elevating the senior most army officer to that position, and then plucking the junior most eligible army officer, Ziaul Haq, to become the new army chief, trying to counterbalance those two four stars against one another. That obviously fails and ends up being Bhutto's undoing.
Yeah, it failed miserably, and yeah, he was tipped as a docile and an unassuming general who be any would not pose any threat to a very preponderant Bhutto, and he was at the height of his power back then. It's interesting that these perceptions of one's power. So Bhutto was a hawk until December 20, 1971. But then Bhutto tried to, his anger or his, rhetoric towards India attenuated because of the perception of power, of lack of power. Uh, and obviously, I don't see this happening with Modi 3.0. I think he still, or on the face of it, he will tell everybody that and he has made some statements that we have got a mandate, we are in power, we had allies before as well, we have allies now too, so nothing changes for us. Words to that effect have been said in so many words. But it would be interesting now to see, look, Modi has invested a lot in creating a certain kind of an image about himself and also about Pakistan. So getting getting off the ramp or finding off ramps would be suicidal, both in terms of uh, public opinion and also in terms of satisfying or keeping the inner circle happy. When you have increased your rhetoric to a point that you're saying that um, we will retake territory from Pakistan, which rightfully, so to speak, belongs to India. Uh, you couple that with calls for Akhand Bharat, for this idea of Hindutva has, or I think Jaffery coins a very good term, Moditva. That obviously ideology has a great impact, I believe, on foreign policy, and that I believe would negatively affect any efforts to turn a page between India and Pakistan. So I want your thoughts on this ideology, the Hindutva ideology, which has seeped into India's, so to speak, into India's strategic culture. I remember when the Rafale aircraft landed in India, they were garlanded with a very Hindutvaized kind of those garlands. So and a virtually a religious ceremony took place besides the aircraft. So when the ideological fervor is this high, don't you think it will become difficult for Modi to even think about uh, attempting a peace with Pakistan?
Well, I take your point. Um, and I do think some brands are more compatible with peace initiatives than other, but normally political scientists talk about hawks, if anything, having an advantage, right? Because if a hawk comes to you and says we should make peace with our adversary, then they have unique credibility because they built a career saying that the opposite was required. And so if they say now is a time for peace, you tend to believe hawks more, political scientists argue, than doves, because doves always want peace, right? So they're always selling that same product. Um, so my hunch is Modi would be able to sell it if he so desired. Um, he has obviously built a fair amount of room to maneuver with China, where he has quite studiously avoided talking about um, likely territorial losses that have occurred since he was inaugurated in 2014 in order to make a future negotiation where they might change the status quo modestly easier. I think he consciously was aware of Nehru not preserving freedom of maneuver when it came to China, and he has tried to avoid getting trapped in the same way. Now, the branding with regards to Pakistan has been more central to Modi's identity than the China front in terms of Modi as a defender of India and someone that helps India escape 1,000 years of slavery. But even here, there's very little criticism that occurred after the 2021 line of control ceasefire, for example, that he worked out with former Army Chief Bajwa, and he similarly the corridor of Sikh holy sites in Punjab has that also did not generate an enormous amount of pushback from hawks in India. So my hunch is if Modi wanted to put his shoulder down, he could probably do so. But my read of the historical evidence is when there is this perceived squishiness with domestic politics and the competing elites, leaders just are very, very scared to do so, and things really have to align for them domestically. And I think the election probably misaligned things more than aligned them.
Thank you for this point. I think, and you also talk in the book, it takes two to tango. I think overall, we could we should be cautious in making any positive predictions about Indo-Pak peace dialogue or peace. Peace is a far shot, but even dialogue appears to be appears to be quite it does not appear to be in the offing. Um, Pakistan's current economic and political situation does not bode well. Uh, the ins Look, the incentive for peace in South Asia would always remain. We are geographically contiguous. We are in need of regional connectivity more than ever. But obviously, and we obviously face a number of common threats like water scarcity, climate change, um, these being two of the most, and food insecurity. But to to assume that these three common threats will um, provide the impetus for Indian and Pakistani leaders to come together on the negotiating table is a bit hard for me to say. Um, but it has got more to do with now with perhaps Modi not thinking that we need to spend a lot of time on Pakistan, and also Pakistan's own precarious political situation. So while the economic situation incentivizes somewhat of a somewhat of a peaceful settlement between the two countries, the political situation in Pakistan does not give any bandwidth to the current setup to um, take the plunge when it comes to dealing with India. Uh, you know what's happening in the country. The current dispensation is weak, uh, and in some ways, and in a lot of ways, rather lacking political legitimacy. So these are some of the concerns that I believe will impede peace between India and Pakistan going forward. Any thoughts?
Sure.
Sure.
So, if we talk about the election in India having modestly eroded Modi's authority within that system, you can use a similar set of calculations to look at the Pakistani system. And you have the Pakistani system has been riven since 2007 with a civil military split that is very severe. And now, on top of that civil military problem, you have probably a split within the PMLN about what to do. And certainly, I think some opportunism on the part of the PPP trying to figure out if there's a way to emerge out of this period of austerity with more popularity than their nominal, partners in government. And then on the outside, you have a very angry PTI who is looking for anything to pick up and to bang over the head of what they view as an illegitimate prime ministership. So that is the strategic incentives on the Pakistani side are all blaring because the economy's in a mess. The domestic terrorism problem, militancy problem is increasing. Relations with Afghanistan and Iran are poor. So it would be good to improve one of those relations. So the strategic incentives on the Pakistani side are clear, but as you laid out, the constellation of power domestically is the opposite of leader primacy. It is thoroughly fractured. And I think as part of the reason, we're stuck in the mud. I think and there is also perhaps in this case some anticipatory um, calculation on the Indian side that they are wary of starting a process that, were it to succeed, might have invite spoilers to wade in. I think that sort of strategic calculation is not so common in my read of the history, but the Lahore to Kargil memory is not so far in the past, and there is still, I think, a lot of wariness about a big initiative, perhaps dooming a civilian government on the Pakistani side. And so I think that does engender some wariness from Indian interlocutors. I think the more important thing is the ideological branding that we talked about, but there is this other element that does merit mentioning.
Yes, I think if one were to rename your theory in the context of current Pakistan, one could call it the public primacy theory, because right now probably the Pakistani government might not have um, challenges from within, like from the setup. The setup is seemingly thinking alike, probably. But from the public, if let's say if the current prime minister talks about launching a peace initiative with India, the uproar on X or Twitter or other TikTok and everywhere would be huge, and so instead of worrying about the elites within the system, uh, the current officials might be more worried about what people outside of the system will say about uh, any peace initiative that the government might launch. There
But
were
let me analyze that just a bit, which is when the elites are fighting, they are looking for a way to drag the public in on their side. So uh, I don't think at the beginning of Prime Minister Imran Khan's term, there was a big disagreement on India policy. In fact, I don't think there was a disagreement on India policy until after Imran Khan and the army chief started fighting. Once they started fighting mostly about other issues, uh, then India gets dragged in and exacerbates this thing. And that happens often, in my view, within rival states, is once the elites start fighting, then the policies toward adversary countries, um, they take on almost like a heightened role, and things that used to be easy become hard again. And that's not, here I'm giving examples in Pakistan, but we can find these recurrently in the US and many other places around the world.
Yes, and obviously the public then becomes a very important part of the entire process, or public could actually become a spoiler as well at times in matters like this. It is certainly an important issue to understand, the linkage between leaders, the elite, and the publics, not only in India and Pakistan, but obviously elsewhere too. Um, my last question is related to, you know, we have seen multiple crises and near misses between India and Pakistan since starting from the Kargil conflict of 1999. And obviously, the 2019 crisis was different in more ways than one. Um, One, we saw a nuclear armed state use air power against another nuclear armed state. That too on a legal territory, not inside a contested piece of land, but on Balakot was part of Pakistan proper. So obviously that had implications for theory as well. And I remember um, Frank O'Donnell wrote a piece calling it India's counter nuclear revolution. Um, so of course now with in India having used air power against Pakistan's mainland, in your opinion, a next Indo-Pak crisis, how would that play out? Now we can't really make a prediction, but I believe, given the stakes involved, we it will have to be Balakot plus and and obviously Rajouri plus. And the plus side of everything will complicate the situation. You know, 10 meters here, 10 meters there could change things precipitously, especially when nuclear weapons are involved.
Sure, I think the region remains crisis prone. Um, it has been a positive development, in my view, that the government of India seems to have determined that it cannot use large-scale ground operations as a way to punish Pakistan for perceived support for militancy or terrorism within India. So there was a theory that the Indian Army proposed about limited war from a cold start. I think that theory had some purchase in the immediate aftermath of Cargill and the 2001-2002 crisis. Um, but since Mumbai, I think there's been a recalibration and both whatever occurred in 2016, it's not clear to me still what happened in 2016. Um, Smaller scale skirmishing along the LOC, I think that is something both countries can figure out. And then now India, I think, has shown its interest in using standoff airstrikes. Now, the problem, as you indicate, is these things are still unpredictable and tit for tat spirals um, can emerge. I have talked to my Indian counterparts for some time, over a decade now, and I say to them, I am worried that Israel's present is like India's future. Israel has considerable qualitative advantages over all of its neighbors, um, and it can launch standoff airstrikes whenever it wants to. But it's not clear to me it makes Israel that much more secure. In fact, it just sometimes gets it trapped into conflicts. Now, the degree of Indian qualitative or quantitative advantage over Pakistan is not nearly as much as Israel's with its neighbors. But just because India might be able to successfully launch a standoff airstrike, doesn't mean that that is going to achieve much politically, and it doesn't mean that India can deter a retaliatory strike from Pakistan. So um, I am still worried, and I think the contours of the 2019 crisis show um, why it is dangerous to throw munitions at each other as a tool of statecraft. That these things are unpredictable. And I think the last few months in Kashmir underscore my concern, because I do think violence has modestly risen in my estimation compared to what it was like in the last few years. And a large scale attack could occur any day. Um, and I should also state that I believe there is adequate evidence that India likely has launched a targeted killing program of anti-India militants within Pakistan. I don't think that evidence is bulletproof, but I do think the preponderance of evidence now favors that. If that is true, or even if that is perceived to be true in Pakistan, then I do think that puts some pressures on the army and the ISI as guarantors of Pakistani sovereignty, to not allow India to get away with things. And so I think that provides an escalatory pressure on the Pakistani side in the event of a future crisis. So I'm worried. And sadly, I think the politics of peace in South Asia will remain difficult for some time.
Thank you very much for a multi-pronged answer to this question. I believe people who look at escalatory scenarios in South Asia should obviously increase the canvas when it comes to looking at the sources of escalation. I believe subconventional war has been has been ongoing between the two countries, and when I say between the two countries, I mean being done by both countries. It's important to also recognize India's subconventional operations within Pakistan and also in Afghanistan, and I think there's a good deal of evidence now to back these claims. Regardless, given the fact that the three levels of war, conventional, subconventional, conventional, and nuclear, given that they feed into each other, um, the prospect of escalation is dangerously high. And because we don't talk to each other, we have um, little to no crisis communication channels at the bilateral level. Um or we should obviously all be worried about any future crisis scenario. With that, I would like to thank you for taking out the time to join me in this conversation. It was a pleasure talking to you about your book and about the overall prospect of peace between India and Pakistan. And it's good. We often use India and Pakistan interchangeably with South Asia, although that probably could lead to analytical problems. And then there are other problems now associated with terminology like South Asia and Southern Asia. But that is for another time and for another occasion. Thank you once again. It was a pleasure talking to you, and we look forward to carrying our discussions forward. Thank you.
I was delighted to be here, even if our topic was not always delightful, but I was happy to have the conversation with you. Thank you for having me.
But we hope that we as academicians, people like you, can drive home the point that peace in South Asia is important for everyone, not only the people in South Asia, but also other. It's very important for the US. Peace in South Asia is of paramount importance to the US, uh, and we should always have hope, and and we should do our level best wherever we can. Thank you very much. That's it. That's it from this conversation. We look forward to hosting more conversations like this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.